Good morning, everyone. I've been here long enough, and for those who have heard me preach or got to know me, it will come no surprise to you that maybe as a part of the generation I come from, I am and always have been a big fan of Star Wars. And back when I was a kid, and even now to a degree, I always preferred the villains. Darth Vader, Boba Fett, the bounty hunters. In fact, when I was a kid, the first of my little figures to die was always Luke Skywalker. He'd get thrown into the Sarlacc pit or get cut down by Darth Vader. And I reflected, why was this? Why is it that I preferred the bad guys to the good guys? It's because the reality is, in Star Wars, the good guys were always boring. They didn't have fancy costumes. They didn't have menacing weapons. They weren't cool. Luke Skywalker or Princess Leia were about as plain as they could come. But the villains had unbelievably cool costumes and nice spaceships. We see this also other places in culture and film. Look at the Lord of the Rings. No one is more boring and plain than the hobbits. They're short, they have no special powers. But compare them to the great villains, the Uruk-hai, the Orcs, Sauron. The evil villains look cool. They can destroy things with their powers and their weapons. And generally this is something that we see throughout culture and throughout film. The villains are often much more alluring. They're the ones who look cooler, and in a certain sense, to draw you into their evil. But even more, in this sort of typical perception of evil, they're hideous in order to distinguish them from the good guys. Very clearly, you know these are the bad guys because of the way they dress, because of the way they act. They don't look like good guys. Even more so, we see this in Hollywood's depiction of the spiritual battle. The Exorcist and all of the movies that deal with demons and possession. The demons are always these hideous figures. They're always very, very frightening and very, very menacing. You know the individual who's possessed by the devil because they're coughing up black bile and walking up backwards like a spider on the ceiling. The good guys don't do that. And so it's convinced us in a great degree that this is what evil is like. If we're going to spot evil in our culture, we're so influenced by Hollywood that we're looking for this hideous, menacing villain. But in reality, if we pay attention to the gospel, we're going to see that in reality, in particular our spiritual lives, evil acts in just the opposite manner. Look at today's gospel. We have the weeds growing in the field that were sown by the master, by the good guy. But while everyone was asleep, the enemy came. The enemy here is the evil one, and he sows weeds to the wheat and then goes off. He does it secretly, in the darkness, never drawing attention to himself. Very, very hidden, very, very subtle. And then he leaves. He doesn't announce his arrival. He doesn't torch all the weeds. He doesn't give off this evil, wicked laugh. He's not wearing some terrible costume. He doesn't challenge the good guy for a battle. He comes clandestinely. He comes hidden, not tempting, not fear-mongering, not destroying, but still working his evil plot. And as a result, we often don't notice until the damage is already done. That's how the evil one works in our world. That's how he works in our life. And there's a phrase that was coined last century by a famous Jewish philosopher that sort of best describes this. The philosopher was named Hannah Arendt, and she wrote a book in the early 60s called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And it was about the SS commander Adolf Eichmann and his trial, the man who, along with Hitler, were the main architects of the Holocaust. And Eichmann was on trial for his war crimes, and Arendt was there witnessing this. And Eichmann comes in not as some 6-foot-tall villain, grimacing and mean and filled with hate, but a small little bureaucrat with glasses, looking like a nerd, like someone that you would never be threatened by. But he orchestrated the death of nearly 6 million Jews. And so she said, in looking at this man who seemed to be so ordinary, so boring, so stupid, so commonplace, she coined the term the banality of evil. Banality from the word banal, or if you want to be fancy, banal, which means something commonplace, something ordinary, something that you would not notice. That in Eichmann, as in so much of the evil of the 20th century, it is true evil, true villainy, but on the facade, it looks ordinary. It looks commonplace. It does not have this allure of this viciousness that we would expect. But yet, it is true evil. It lacks originality. It lacks creativity. And that banality of evil is something that is peculiar in a certain sense to our time and our culture. We're looking at evil in the face and we don't even recognize it because we expect evil to look like and act like something completely different. I was reminded of this phrase from Hannah Arendt last week when I was with a youth group. And we were at a big youth conference in Kentucky. And every year we go, and one of the main parts of this youth conference is taking the 350 students into Louisville, Kentucky to pray a rosary at the abortion clinic there downtown. Over my years as a priest, I've gone to numerous abortion clinics to pray and to have vigils there. Always very peaceful, always very prayerful. But as I was there, I realized, in talking to the students, many of them who had never gone to pray in an abortion clinic, that what they expected the abortion clinic to be like and what it was really like, at least on the facade, was radically different. So often I think they expected, as they were riding on the bus to Louisville, the abortion clinic to look like Mordor, or to look like the Death Star, something large and menacing and evil and hideous. But in fact, the exact opposite is the case. As it was there, and as it has been in every single abortion clinic that I have gone to pray at. The facade was plain, a one-story building made of brown, tannish brick. Very, very nondescript, boring lettering. Windows and a very simple entrance. Of course, not to draw attention to itself, because they do not want to be harassed. They want to sort of pass by under the radar. But if you walk by and you didn't know what it was, you'd think it was an insurance salesman's office built in the late 70s. Absolutely banal. Absolutely nondescript. But yet we know what goes on behind that facade, the terrible atrocity of abortion. It reminds me of the case from a couple of years ago that we talked so much about. Kermit Gosnell, his House of Horrors. Even the media recognized it. But if you remember, what does abortion clinic look like? In downtown Philadelphia, it was a 3-story dilapidated brown building. Something that you would walk past every day and not even notice, A, that it was an abortion clinic, or B, of the terrible tragedies that occurred inside. A reminder that this facade is what we often see, and we don't think anything about it when it comes to these moral issues or when it comes to the spiritual issues, particularly pertain to the issue of abortion. But indeed, it is a facade for real evil. I'm not saying that those who have or support abortion are possessed by the devil, but it is a reminder to us that the evil one lurks behind the facade of banality. He works behind the scenes. And I can tell you as a priest now for 14 years, working on the front line of the spiritual battle, but also standing for life, I can assure you that Satan is behind this. Anytime we see the destruction of youth, particularly for a supposed reason or a supposed cause, the evil one is behind it. I can tell you a number of stories. One thing that particularly stands out when we were there praying, there was a young woman who was acting as an escort. They have a number of people who escort the women into the abortion clinics. And one of the priests began talking and dialoguing with her and asked her name. She said that her name was Christina. And he said, do you know that the word Christina, your name, comes from Christ? And she says, yes, I know. I hate the fact that my parents named me that. I wish they would have named me Beelzebub, or also Satan. She just may have been saying this in passing, or even as a joke, but there's a reality there. The hatred for Christ, the hatred for things spiritual, the banality of evil that we must recognize. And so that's the message of today's gospel. Not only in the moral life, but in our own spiritual life, we expect the threat. We expect the temptation. We expect the evil to be right there in our face, challenging us, hideous, easily recognizable. But the fact is, that's not the way it works. Satan and moral evil often work behind the scenes, sowing their seeds, their weeds at night. We don't even recognize it. Behind things that are so commonplace, so ordinary, so nondescript, so banal. And so that we as Christians who realize that the real battle is not with the flesh, is not going to be won on the political side, but on the spiritual side. That we're battling principalities and powers, as Paul tells us. The real spiritual battle that is going on, that we need to pray for discernment. Not to be able to scapegoat, not be able to cast other people as demons or judge others, but to realize what's really going on, to be more aware of the spiritual presence and battle that is going on in our world and in our lives, so that we can call out Satan for who he is, to recognize and help others recognize what is really going on. More importantly, through our trust in Jesus Christ, to cooperate and work for the triumph of good in our world. Amen.